You know that feeling like you're trying to catch smoke. You know it's there, you see its shape, but as soon as you reach for it, it just changes, slips right through your fingers.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
That's kind of what we're hunting today. Something that, well, sometimes looks like a wise teacher, sometimes like a really smooth talking con artist, maybe even like a politician sometimes. Something incredibly elusive.
That's a perfect description, actually. We are jumping into an ancient philosophical hunt, trying to pin down this figure who was, a big deal in ancient Greece, but whose actual nature was really, really debated.
Exactly. So our deep dive today is into Plato's fascinating and, let's be honest, sometimes pretty challenging dialogue called the Sophist.
Right.
We're using notes that come from a detailed commentary on it. Think of it like getting a guided tour through someone else's really careful reading of this ancient text, sourced via Project Gutenberg.
And the scene is set up in that classic Plato way. You've got Socrates, his friend Theaetetus, and then there's this new arrival, the Eleatic stranger, who everyone assumes is, super wise. And boom, right away, Socrates asks this huge question. Are the sophist, the statesman, and the philosopher just like different names for one type of person, or are they three totally distinct kinds?
It's like Socrates is basically setting the stage for a big philosophical sorting game, isn't it?
Totally.
And our mission, really, in this deep dive is to follow their chase, specifically zeroing in on defining the sophist. Where does this ancient investigation actually lead? And what kind of surprising philosophical territory do we end up having to cover to finally get a handle on who or what a sophist really is?
And importantly, this isn't just, some dusty academic exercise about ancient Greeks. The
Yeah.
challenge they're facing figuring out who's a genuine expert versus who's just a clever imitator.
Yeah.
And maybe even more fundamentally, how do we even tell truth apart from falsehood when words themselves can be so slippery? These are absolutely central questions for us right here, right now.
Definitely. So this deep dive should give you a framework pulled straight from Plato's thinking for grappling with those very issues in our own lives. So let's get into it. How do they even start this hunt?
Well, the Eleatic stranger, he proposes this method he really likes. Definition by division.
Okay.
The idea is you start with a really broad category, something that definitely includes the thing you're looking for, and then you systematically divide it, always into two parts, and you choose the branch that contains your target.
Ah,
And you just keep dividing, keep narrowing it down until you've isolated exactly what you're trying to define.
got it. Like creating a really detailed flowchart or maybe
Yeah.
like a biological classification key.
Exactly. And to make it super clear, they start with a simple, almost kind of funny example,
Hmm.
defining the angler.
The fisherman. Okay.
Right, so you start super broad. What is angling? Well, it's a kind of art. Okay, simple enough. Within art, is it about producing something new or acquiring something that's already out there? Well, an angler acquires stuff.
Right. He catches fish that already exist. So acquisitive art.
Precisely. Then how do you acquire? By exchange, like trading, or by capturing, hunting. An angler definitely hunts.
Okay. Conquest hunting makes sense.
What do they hunt? Like inanimate things?
Oh.
Or animals. Animals. Okay, animal hunting.
Land or water.
Water. So, water animal hunting, which is basically, fishing.
And how do they fish? Do they use nets, enclosed things, or do they strike the animal?
They strike, right, with hooks or spears. So striking,
Very specific now.
and then even more specific, how do they strike? With a hook that pulls the fish up from below upwards.
Aha. So after that whole chain, art, acquisitive, conquest hunting, animal hunting, water, animals, fishing, striking, with hook spears, fishing from below upwards. There you have it, the angler. Defined. It almost seems like overly complicated for something so simple, doesn't it?
It does seem that way, but the text makes a really key point right after this. The stranger points out that the angler and the sophist are presented as cousins
Cousins. How so?
because they both fall under that early branch of hunting or conquest in the division.
Ah, okay.
This signals that this method, even with just the simple angler example, is already kind of hinting at the sophist's nature, that he acquires something valuable, maybe people, through some form of capture or hunting.
Okay, interesting foreshadowing. So let's apply this division method to the sophist himself. Where do we begin? Back at acquisitive art.
Exactly. We start right back there. And just like the angler, the sophist is acquisitive, and he acquires by hunting, not exchange. Well, at least in this first attempt.
Okay, hunting. But he hunts land animals, not fish.
Yes, land animals, and specifically not wild ones, but tame ones.
And the tamest animal.
Yeah.
Meh. Okay, so the sophist hunts humans.
Yeah.
How? by force. Or persuasion?
Persuasion. Definitely persuasion. And is it public persuasion, like, say, a politician giving a speech? Or is it private?
Private, I guess, for a sophist.
That's the path they take, private persuasion.
Okay. And among those who use private persuasion, do they do it through gifts? Like maybe lovers trying to woo someone? Or do they do it for hire?
For hire. They charge money.
Right. And among those who persuade privately for hire, do they just flatter people? Or do they claim to teach virtue or education for a fee?
Ah, there it is. They profess to teach virtue or education for money.
And who is that? According to this first run-through with the division method, that is the sophist, a paid hunter of wealthy young men selling them supposed wisdom.
That's definition number one, straight from the method. But remember, you said he was elusive.
Yeah, slippery.
Exactly. The stranger immediately finds other paths. He actually goes back to that earlier fork, acquisitive art. What if it's not hunting, but exchange?
Okay, interesting. So if he acquires by exchange, does he, like, give stuff away or sell it?
He sells. Definitely sells.
Right. And does he sell his own creations? Or does he trade in things he's bought from others, like a middleman?
Well, the text suggests he might do both. He could be like a merchant importing knowledge, or like a retailer selling stuff he bought, or even a manufacturer selling his own wares.
And what is he selling? Not fish this time.
No, he's selling knowledge, wares of the soul, as the text puts it.
Wares of the soul. Okay.
So, following this exchange branch, the sophist gets defined now as, well, a merchant of knowledge,
Yeah.
importing and selling, and maybe a retailer or even a kind of manufacturer of knowledge, selling his own homemade ideas.
Wow. Okay. So now we've got the paid hunter of young men, the merchant importing knowledge, and the retailer selling it, maybe even making it himself. That's 3 definitions already. And they came from just 2 initial paths under acquisitive art. This guy is hard to pin down.
But wait, there's more. There's another path they explore under acquisitive art. Combative.
Ah, fighting. That sounds like a sophist.
Right. The sophist is clearly combative, but specifically with words. Argument.
Okay, fighting with arguments. Is it like public debates in the assembly, or is it private disputes?
Private. Definitely private, according to this line.
And is it just like general arguing? Or is it that specific kind, heuristic, arguing just to win, often for money?
Exactly that, heuristic debating. The text actually calls it higgling over an argument, like haggling in a market, but with words.
Okay, that makes sense. So definition number 4, a paid heuristic debater, someone who argues privately for cash, often just to score points, haggling over definitions and logic. That definitely fits one popular image of the sophist.
It does. But now here's where the method takes a really surprising turn. It feels less like strict division and more like exploring concepts that are related to division.
How so?
The stranger starts thinking about the idea of division or separation itself, not just as a tool for defining things, but as a kind of art, the art of purification.
Purification, like cleansing something.
Exactly. Like
Yeah.
you can purify the body, right? With medicine or maybe just taking a bath. Or, he suggests, you can purify the soul.
Okay, what pollutes the soul?
Wickedness, he says, but especially ignorance. And not just any ignorance. The worst kind is when you think you know something, but you actually don't. That's conceit, false confidence.
Right, that sounds pretty bad. So how do you purify the soul of that kind of ignorance, that conceit?
By questioning someone, examining them, showing them the contradictions in their own beliefs until they realize they don't know what they thought they knew. You convict them out of their own mouth, basically. Make them feel ashamed of their ignorance so they actually start to desire real knowledge.
Wait, hang on a second. Examining people, questioning them, showing them they don't really know what they think they know, making them want wisdom. Isn't that what Socrates does?
Bingo. And this leads to the 5th and honestly the most startling potential definition they uncover. The sophist as a purger of souls, someone who cleanses others of ignorance and conceit. Just like Socrates.
Whoa, hold on. So the sophist could actually be a kind of philosopher, or at least using the philosopher's own method. That seems wrong somehow.
This is where the source material, the commentary we're using, gets really critical. The text itself presents this definition as highly doubtful. It uses this great analogy, comparing the sophist here to a wolf that just looks a lot like a dog.
Ah, the wolf in dog's clothing.
Exactly. The method of questioning might look the same on the surface, but is the nature the same? Is the intent the same? Does the sophist really purify, aiming for truth? Or is he just imitating purification?
Ah, imitation again. that keeps coming up. This suggests maybe the sophist doesn't have real knowledge himself, just the appearance of it.
Right place.
He can argue about anything, not because he actually knows everything, but because he's really good at creating the semblance of knowledge, using tricky arguments, juggling with words, as the text put it.
That's exactly the idea.
Yeah.
The sophist is starting to look less like someone defined by a specific skill, like hunting or trading knowledge, and more like someone whose core activity is creating appearances or images with words, rather than dealing with reality or truth itself.
Right.
And the text kind of summarizes all these different forms they found. Hunter, merchant, retailer, maybe manufacturer, the heuristic disputant, and this very doubtful purger of souls.
That is a lot of different faces for one type of person. The source commentary notes that having so many definitions strongly suggests they haven't quite hit the nail on the head yet, haven't captured his true essence. He is like a many-sided animal.
Yeah.
He's elusive precisely because he doesn't seem to have a single stable nature like, say, the angler does.
But just as they try to zero in on this idea, defining him as an image maker, someone who deals in appearances, illusion, maybe even falsehood, they smack right into a massive philosophical brick wall.
Okay, here we go. This is where things get really deep and maybe a bit mind-bending, right?
Definitely. The problem comes from some earlier philosophers, the Eleatics, think Parmenides, Zeno. They had this incredibly powerful logical argument. What is not simply cannot exist, period.
Okay. What is not cannot exist.
Their reasoning seemed airtight. If something is not, well, then it has no being at all. If it has no being, you can't talk about it, you can't think about it, you can't even refer to it. Trying to talk about non-existence is like trying to talk about nothing, which seems impossible. Only being is, not being. Well, it's just nothing, utterly nothing.
Okay, that sounds logically sound, even if it makes my head spin a little. But why is that a problem for defining the sophist?
Because, and this is the kicker, if what is not cannot exist, be spoken, or even thought about, then false statements are impossible.
False statements are impossible. How does that follow?
Well, think about what a false statement does. It says something is the case when, in reality, it is not.
Right.
Take the example they use in the dialogue. Theaetetus flies. We look over at Theaetetus, and he's clearly sitting down. He is not flying.
Okay.
The statement Theaetetus flies says that flying, as applied to Theaetetus right now, which is something that is not happening, is happening. It attributes being to something that, for Theaetetus, currently is not.
So, if what is not, like Theaetetus flying right now, is utterly non-existent and unspeakable according to those Eleatic guys, then the statement Theaetetus flies is trying to speak about nothing. It just becomes meaningless noise.
Exactly. The statement tries to link Theaetetus to something flying that, in relation to him, has no being. If what is not is pure, absolute non-existence, then the whole statement just dissolves into nonsense. You literally cannot speak falsehood because you would be trying to speak about nothing.
Wow, okay, that is a huge problem. Because if you can't speak falsehood, then presumably you can't think falsehood, you can't have a false opinion, you can't create a false image.
Right.
Which means the sophist, who we were just about to define as someone dealing in falsehood and false appearances, he can't actually exist. Or at least that definition falls apart.
The sophist gets off scot-free, philosophically speaking. And even worse, if we can't actually distinguish truth from falsehood, because falsehood is impossible, then how can we ever distinguish the philosopher who seeks truth from the sophist who we thought dealt in illusions? The whole project is blocked.
Blocked by this incredibly fundamental logical puzzle about whether not being is even a thing we can talk about.
Precisely. It's a major roadblock rooted in the most basic metaphysics.
Okay, so how on earth does Plato, speaking through the Eleatic stranger here, get around this? This feels like the absolute crux of the whole dialogue, the whole deep dive, really.
It absolutely is, and this is arguably Plato's major philosophical contribution in the Sophist. The breakthrough comes from realizing that not being doesn't have to mean the absolute total opposite of being, like complete annihilation or utter non-existence.
Okay. So if it doesn't mean non-existence, what else could not being mean?
It could mean difference. It could mean otherness.
Difference, otherness.
Yeah, think about it simply. If I say something is not great, does that mean it just poofs out of existence? No, of course not.
Right.
It just means it's different from great. It still exists. It has its own being, but its being is other than the being of great.
Okay, I think I see that. So not being is in the void. It's just being different from something else.
Yeah. That's the core idea. Not being, understood as difference or otherness, is itself a kind or form of being. It exists as difference, But to make this work, Plato needs another crucial concept, the communion of kinds, or sometimes called the communion of ideas.
Communion of kinds, combining ideas, what does that mean?
Yes, combining ideas. Plato argues that these fundamental concepts or kinds, things like being itself, rest, motion, sameness, and now otherness or difference, they aren't just isolated concepts floating around. They can, and indeed they must, combine with each other.
Like ingredients in a recipe.
Sort of. Or maybe like how certain letters can combine to form words while others can't. Or how musical notes combine to make harmony. Some forms or kinds blend, others don't.
Why do they have to combine? Why is that necessary?
Because if ideas couldn't combine, we couldn't actually make any statement at all. Think about it. We couldn't say Theaetetus is sitting. That statement combines the idea of Theaetetus with the idea of being and the idea of sitting. We couldn't say motion is. That combines motion and being. This very act of saying one thing is another or has a certain quality, what philosophers call predication, relies entirely on the fact that these fundamental ideas or kinds can connect and blend with each other.
Okay, that makes sense. So, recap. Not being is really just difference, and ideas have to be able to combine for us to even think or speak. How does putting those two insights together solve the puzzle of falsehood? Can you walk me through Theaetetus flies again with these new tools?
Absolutely. Let's do it. The statement Theaetetus flies is false. Why? According to Plato now, it's not because flying is some kind of utter non-existence. Flying definitely exists as a concept, as an action birds do, etc.
Right.
The statement is false because it tries to connect Theaetetus, the subject, to something flying that is different from what he is actually doing right now.
He is sitting, and sitting is different from flying.
Exactly. The statement says that Theaetetus is flying, but flying is actually something other than or different from what Theaetetus currently is, which is sitting.
So the false statement takes this thing that is different from Theaetetus's current state, flying, and wrongly attaches it to him as if it were his current state. It presents difference as sameness, in a way.
Yes, that's a great way to put it. It attributes difference, what he is not, in the sense of being different, as if it were being what he is or what pertains to his being right now.
Yeah.
And crucially, because not being understood as difference does exist as one of the forms or kinds it has, being as difference, talking about this difference, even attributing it wrongly to a subject, is perfectly possible within language and thought.
Okay, I think the light bulb just went on. The Eleatic said what is not is pure nothing, so you can't even point to it or talk about it. Plato says no, what is not often just means what is different, and difference is a real thing. It's one of the basic categories of reality.
Exactly.
So referring to something that is different from your subject, like flying is different from sitting Theaetetus, is possible. And falsely linking that difference to your subject as if it weren't different, that's also possible. That's what a false statement is.
You've got it. That's precisely the move. By reinterpreting not being as relative difference and showing that difference itself is a form of being that can combine with other forms, Plato successfully rescues the possibility of false speech, false opinion, and false appearance or imagination.
Which means the sophist, the image maker, the guy who deals in convincing appearances, he can't exist after all. The huge philosophical roadblock is gone.
It's gone. We can finally confidently place the sophist. He is that figure who practices image-making or fantastic art, the art of creating appearances that seem real but aren't necessarily true likenesses. He deals in falsehoods precisely by linking subjects, like virtue or knowledge, to things that are different from them, presenting that difference as if it were their true being.
So that whole massive detour through the metaphysics of being and not being, it was absolutely essential to philosophically justify the very possibility of the sophist's stock and trade, the realm of falsehood and appearance. Wow, that's some serious philosophical heavy lifting just to define one type of person.
It really shows how deeply Plato thought about these interconnected problems. And the source commentary points out, the historical context, Plato's negative view of sophists wasn't entirely out of the blue. The term already had some baggage.
Yeah.
But Plato provided this incredibly deep philosophical critique, grounding the distinction between the philosopher and the sophist in their fundamental relationship to truth and falsehood, which first required him to figure out the very nature of falsehood itself.
And the source material also brings up a connection to later philosophy, specifically to Hegel, which I thought was really interesting.
Yes, that's a fascinating point. Plato's whole struggle here with being and not being, his crucial idea of not being as difference or otherness, and the concept of ideas interacting dynamically, the communion of kinds, which is a form of dialectic core. These are all seen by many as anticipating major themes in Hegelian philosophy centuries later.
So Hegel's ideas about, the unity of opposites and how things progress through conflict or antagonism, that's kind of echoing this Platonic struggle.
In a way, yes. Hegel revisits very similar territory about negation, difference, and dialectical movement, although he builds into a much larger, more complex historical system. The commentary suggests that while Hegel definitely builds on Plato, their focus might have been different. Plato was trying to solve a very specific, pressing logical problem posed by the Eleatics to make sense of falsehood.
Whereas Hegel was maybe building a grand theory of everything.
Something like that. But the core insight that negation or not being isn't just an empty void, but is actually a form of relatedness, of difference, and that ideas aren't static but interact. That's a powerful thread running from Plato through Hegel and beyond. It shows these are deep, recurring challenges in how we think about reality and language.
Okay, so let's try to pull back and quickly recap this whole journey. We started off trying to hunt down this slippery figure, the sophist, using Plato's method of division. We found all these different potential descriptions, the hunter, the merchant, the debater, maybe even this weird doubtful purifier, which all started pointing towards the idea that he's fundamentally an imitator.
Right. But trying to pin him down as an imitator, someone dealing in appearances and falsehood, forced us to confront that massive Eleatic puzzle. How can we even talk about falsehood if what is not is just nothing?
And the big breakthrough was Plato's really elegant solution. Not being doesn't have to mean absolute nothingness. It can just mean difference or otherness. And because ideas or kinds can connect and combine the communion of kinds, we can actually make statements that attribute difference to a subject. A false statement does this incorrectly, presenting that difference as if it were the subject's actual being or state.
And that unlocked everything. It made false speech, false opinion, and false appearances philosophically possible again, which finally allowed us to define the sophist, not just by his various activities, but by his essential nature. He's an image maker, a fantastic artist who uses the power of deceptive language to create convincing appearances of knowledge or virtue that he doesn't truly possess.
And the relevance for you listening to this today, well, it couldn't be clearer, could it? We live in a world just saturated with information, with competing claims, where figuring out genuine expertise from a really convincing imitation or telling truth from cleverly constructed falsehoods, it feels harder than ever.
Absolutely.
Plato's ancient struggle gives us a kind of foundational insight into this. It shows us the philosophical roots of how falsehood even works and why appearances, skillfully crafted, can be so powerful and, frankly, so dangerous.
It really offers a framework for thinking critically about the claims we encounter every day. If you notice someone's argument seems to rely on blurring important distinctions, maybe treating things that are really different as if they're the same, or vice versa. Plato's work here helps us see that might not just be sloppy thinking, it could be a move rooted in this very old practice of creating false appearances, a kind of philosophical red flag.
Which leaves us with this final thought to maybe chew on. We've seen how our ability to tell truth from falsehood rests at a deep philosophical level on understanding how ideas connect and how they differ. So what happens in our society right now when people deliberately try to obscure those connections or deliberately try to muddle those differences to make things seem other than they are, or maybe seem the same when they're actually fundamentally distinct?
Yeah, how do we stay vigilant against those who, maybe like the sophists Plato was wrestling with, seem to profit not from sharing genuine knowledge, but from just being really, really good at creating convincing illusions with words? That ancient hunt for clarity, for telling the real from the imitation. It definitely continues, doesn't it?